I've never told this story under my real name, and I'm not about to start now. Call me William. I've carried this around for years, and every now and then it crawls back into my head when I see someone fumbling through their wallet at an airport or absent-mindedly patting their pockets to make sure they still have their passport. That's because one passport changed the direction of my life. Not mine. Someone else's. It ended up in the hands of the one person it absolutely did not belong to. People like to imagine crimes begin with greed or cruelty, but mine started with desperation mixed with arrogance. I was convinced that if I could just get past one obstacle, everything else would somehow fall into place. Looking back, that's probably the biggest lie I ever told myself. At the time I was drowning in debt, bouncing between temporary jobs, and pretending to everyone around me that I was only between opportunities. The truth was uglier. Every bill felt like another countdown timer, and every phone call from an unknown number made my stomach knot. Then chance handed me something I never should have touched. A passport. Not abandoned forever. Not thrown away. Just separated from its owner for long enough that I convinced myself fate had picked a side. That single moment, the second I realized whose document I was holding, was when I crossed a line I'd spent years insisting I would never cross. I wish I could say I immediately turned it in. I didn't. The weird thing is, I didn't even steal it in some dramatic way. There was no movie-style moment, no breaking into a locked room, no elaborate scheme. That's what still bothers me the most. It was ordinary. Almost too ordinary. I found it in a place where people are constantly distracted, a crowded waiting area. Everyone was rushing, checking their phones, looking at departure boards, worrying about their own problems. I noticed a small bag left behind near a seat. At first, I walked past it. Then I stopped. I told myself I was only checking if there was a way to find the owner. That was the excuse I used, anyway. Inside was a wallet, some papers, and the passport. I remember opening it and seeing the stranger's face staring back at me. A person with a name, a history, a life completely separate from mine. For a few seconds, I actually felt uncomfortable. Like the document itself was telling me to put it back. But then my mind started doing what it does best, making excuses. I started thinking about possibilities. About problems I could solve. About doors that might open. And that was the moment I stopped seeing it as someone else's passport. I started seeing it as an opportunity. I kept the passport hidden for a few days before I did anything with it. Looking back, those days were probably the most important part of the whole story, because that was when I still had a choice. I could have returned it. I could have handed it to security, contacted the person, or simply walked away and pretended I never saw it. Instead, I studied it. I told myself I was just trying to understand the situation, but honestly, I was already looking for ways to benefit from it. That's the uncomfortable truth. The crime didn't begin when I used the passport. It began when I decided another person's problem was my opportunity. I started imagining scenarios where everything worked out perfectly. I convinced myself that nobody would be seriously hurt. I told myself that the owner would get a replacement and move on. Those thoughts were lies, but they were convenient lies. The more I repeated them, the easier they became to believe. I was no longer asking, should I do this? I was asking, how can I make this work? Once I had convinced myself I was going through with it, I started acting like I was planning something much bigger than I actually understood. That's the dangerous thing about desperation, it makes you feel smarter than you are. I spent nights thinking about every possible outcome. I imagined being caught, imagined everything falling apart, and then I would tell myself I was being paranoid. I looked at the passport again and again, trying to separate the document from the person it belonged to. That was my biggest mistake. I forgot there was a real person behind the picture. A real person who had probably been standing somewhere, realizing their passport was missing, feeling the same panic I had felt so many times in my own life. But I pushed that thought away. I focused only on myself. On my debts. On my fear. On the fantasy that one bad decision could somehow fix years of bad choices. The truth was, I wasn't solving my problems. I was creating a new one. The day I finally decided to use the passport, I remember feeling strangely calm. That's the part nobody talks about when they describe doing something wrong. You expect panic, shaking hands, some obvious sign that your conscience is screaming. But sometimes your brain does the opposite. Mine went quiet. I had spent so much time thinking about every possibility that, when the moment came, it felt almost routine. I moved through the day pretending everything was normal, while carrying around a secret that felt heavier with every step. I kept checking the passport, then putting it away, almost like I needed to remind myself it was real. There was a rush of adrenaline, too. I hate admitting that. Part of me felt clever, like I had found a way around a problem everyone else would have missed. But underneath that excitement was a feeling I couldn't ignore. Fear. Not just fear of being caught. Fear that I was becoming someone I wouldn't recognize. The person I saw in the mirror that night looked the same, but I knew something had changed. The first real test came when I had to interact with other people while carrying that secret. Before that, the passport had just been an object in my possession. But the moment I stepped into the world with it, everything felt different. Every glance from a stranger made me nervous. Every question sounded suspicious. I started noticing things I had ignored before: how people looked at documents, how carefully officials checked details, how quickly a normal conversation could turn into something uncomfortable. I was constantly calculating. Should I speak more? Should I say less? Should I act confident? Should I look nervous? The funny thing is, the more I tried to appear normal, the less normal I felt. I had always thought criminals were people who looked dangerous or suspicious. I never imagined one day I would be the person hiding something and pretending everything was fine. For a short time, I managed to keep my composure. Nobody immediately stopped me. Nobody accused me. And that almost made things worse. Because every moment I got away with it convinced me I could keep going. The hardest part wasn't what happened during the crime. It was what happened afterward, when I had time to think. When the adrenaline wore off, the silence became unbearable. I would sit alone and replay everything in my head. I kept remembering the face in the passport photo. Not the document, not the name, but the person. I started wondering where they were, what they were doing, and what kind of trouble my decision had caused them. At first, I pushed those thoughts away. I told myself I wasn't responsible for every possible consequence. I told myself people lose things all the time. I created every excuse I could find. But deep down, I knew the truth. Someone else was dealing with a problem because I had chosen to benefit from their mistake. That realization bothered me more than the fear of getting caught. I had spent years thinking I was unlucky, that life had forced me into bad situations. But now I had become the reason someone else's life became harder. And that was a feeling money couldn't fix. A few days later, something happened that I wasn't prepared for. I received a reminder of how real the person behind the passport was. Until then, I had managed to keep my distance. I treated the whole situation like a problem to solve, like some kind of puzzle where I was the only person who mattered. But suddenly, the consequences started feeling less abstract. I began imagining what the owner had gone through after losing it. The stress. The confusion. The questions. Maybe they had plans that depended on that document. Maybe they had family waiting for them somewhere. Maybe they were standing at a counter explaining that something important had disappeared. And I was the reason. That thought followed me everywhere. I tried distracting myself. I worked longer hours, stayed away from people, kept busy. But guilt has a way of finding quiet moments. At night, when everything slowed down, my mind would return to the same question. Who had I become? I still wanted to believe I was a good person who had made one mistake. But part of me knew it wasn't that simple. A mistake happens before you understand the consequences. I understood them. And I continued anyway. The strange thing about guilt is that it doesn't always arrive all at once. Sometimes it comes in small pieces. A song on the radio. A random conversation. Someone complaining about losing their wallet. Little things that shouldn't have mattered suddenly felt like they were aimed directly at me. I started becoming paranoid. Every knock on the door made my heart race. Every unknown call made me wonder if someone had finally connected the dots. The worst part was that nobody around me knew. I could sit with friends, laugh at jokes, have normal conversations, and meanwhile carry this secret that felt like a second life. I hated how easily I could pretend. That scared me more than anything. I always believed bad people were different from everyone else. I thought they had something missing inside them. But I was discovering something uncomfortable. Sometimes ordinary people make terrible choices when they convince themselves they have a good enough reason. I wasn't some mastermind. I was just a person who crossed a line and then had to live with knowing I crossed it. Eventually, the situation started becoming harder to control. That's the thing about secrets, you think you're hiding them, but most of the time they're changing the way you behave. I became more cautious, more distant. People close to me noticed something was off, even if they didn't know why. I gave vague answers, avoided certain conversations, and constantly felt like I was carrying a weight nobody else could see. I also started questioning my own decisions more seriously. In the beginning, I had convinced myself I was doing what I had to do. I told myself circumstances had pushed me into a corner. But the longer I lived with it, the weaker that excuse became. Circumstances didn't force my hand. I made choices. That was the part one struggled with the most. I had always seen myself as someone who tried to do the right thing, even when life was unfair. Now I had proof that, under enough pressure, I was capable of becoming the person I used to judge. And that realization changed the way I saw myself. The moment everything started to fall apart wasn't some dramatic scene like you see in movies. There were no flashing lights, no sudden confrontation, no person pointing a finger at me. It was much quieter than that. It started with a simple conversation. Someone asked a question I wasn't expecting, and for a second, I felt like my entire body stopped working. My mind immediately went through every possible explanation, every excuse, every way I could make the situation seem harmless. That's when I realized how far I had gone. I wasn't just hiding the passport anymore. I was protecting the version of myself that had made the decision to take it. I remember feeling exhausted. Not physically, mentally. The constant fear, the pretending, the endless justifications had drained me. For the first time, I stopped thinking about whether I could get away with it. I started thinking about whether I wanted to keep being this person. And honestly, I didn't have an answer. Because part of me was still afraid of losing everything. But another part of me was tired of losing myself. After that, I started thinking differently about what I had done. Before, my thoughts were always focused on consequences for me. Would I get caught? Would I lose my job? Would people find out? But slowly, that changed. I started thinking about the stranger whose passport I had taken. I wondered how many hours they had spent trying to fix a problem they never created. I wondered if they blamed themselves for being careless, the same way I had blamed myself for everything that went wrong in my own life. That thought stayed with me. Because the truth was, both of us were dealing with consequences from a single moment. The difference was that I had a choice in that moment. They didn't. I spent a long time trying to convince myself I was a victim of circumstances. But eventually I had to admit something painful: I had used someone else's misfortune as a way out. And there was no clever explanation that could change that. For the first time, I stopped asking how I could escape the situation. I started asking how I could take responsibility. I wish I could say that realizing the truth immediately fixed everything. It didn't. Knowing you did something wrong and actually accepting what that means are two different things. I spent a lot of time fighting with myself. One side of me wanted to forget the entire situation and move forward like nothing happened. Another side knew that ignoring it would only make me someone who could repeat the same mistake again. That scared me. Not the possibility of punishment. the possibility of becoming comfortable with doing harm. I started looking back at other moments in my life when I had blamed bad luck, other people, or circumstances for my problems. Maybe this wasn't the first time I had chosen the easier path instead of the right one. The passport was just the moment when I could no longer pretend. It showed me something about myself that I didn't want to see. I learned that the most dangerous thing isn't always the temptation itself. Sometimes it's the story you tell yourself to make the temptation feel acceptable. Eventually, I had to face the reality of what I had done and what kind of person I wanted to be afterward. For a long time, I thought the worst part of a crime was the moment you got caught. I was wrong. The worst part was living with the knowledge that you had crossed a line and knowing there was no way to pretend you hadn't. I carried that passport situation with me long after it was over. Not because someone was chasing me every day. Not because I was constantly looking over my shoulder. Because I had seen a side of myself that I never expected to exist. I learned that people don't always become different overnight. Sometimes it happens through small decisions, small excuses, and small moments where you choose yourself over someone else. That realization stayed with me. I don't tell this story because I think it makes me interesting. Honestly, I think it's one of the moments I'm least proud of. I tell it because I want people to understand how quickly a person can justify something they once believed they would never do. Looking back now, the passport was never really the important part of the story. It was just the object that revealed something about me that I had been ignoring for years. I learned that desperation can make you feel like your choices are limited, but there is always a moment where you decide who you are going to be. Mine was a bad one. I can't change what happened, and I can't erase the stress or fear I caused another person. What I can do is admit it, remember it, and make sure I never become that version of myself again. If you're reading this and you're in a difficult situation, don't wait until you're standing on the other side of a decision wishing you could go back. A shortcut can feel like a solution when you're desperate. Usually, it just creates a different problem, one you have to carry with you. That's what I learned from someone else's passport ending up in my hands. It wasn't an opportunity. It was a test. And I failed it.